Have you ever gotten into an argument with somebody over the interpretation of the Bible, or the interpretation of the Quran, or the interpretation of the Constitution? Or have you ever been misinterpreted? For example, have y'all ever written a letter home and you thought the letter was great, only to get a response or a phone call from your family freaking out because they didn't understand what you meant? Maybe they were panicking. Maybe they took it the wrong way. Maybe they took offense to it in some way. Or maybe you did the same. You took offense or misinterpreted a letter in some way because there were missing variables. You didn't have access to their tone of voice or their facial expressions. All of this is what interpretation is about. There's a real academic term for it called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is just the science or the art and science of interpretation. But if you think about it, interpretation is at the core of human communication. This is something we do every day. Whether we're having arguments about some important text like the Bible and all the different denominations and religions, or the Quran, or the Constitution, and all of the different legal issues surrounding the Supreme Court judgments and what the Constitution says, or science. All of us are in arguments sometimes about how to properly interpret scientific evidence, scientific research. We're doing a lot of that with COVID right now. How should we interpret different sets of data and new research? But it's not just these very important things like the Bible, Quran, Constitution, or scientific research. It's also things like mail, the letters that you write, the letters that you receive. There's a way that you should properly interpret them. Or books that you read, or when you're listening to the news, or reading the news. So we interpret things all day long. That's just how we communicate with each other. And there are certain rules for the appropriate interpretation of a text, like a newspaper or the Bible, and speech, like the speech I'm giving you now, or discussions you have in visitation or in the day room, or when you hear something on TV. There's rules that help you make better and more reliable judgments or interpretations. If you've ever gotten into an argument about the Bible, for example, some guys will break out the concordance, the Strong's Concordance, and they'll start looking at definitions of words in the Greek and the Hebrew because they realize that properly understanding the meanings of the words on the page is important. What were their original definitions? What is the definition we use today different from the ancient definition? You can do the same thing with the Quran. You can do the same thing with the Constitution. What do the words mean back then? What do they mean now? How do we define them? When we get in heated debates and discussions with people, it's always important to try and define the words that you're using. Hot topics like racism and gender. What do those things mean? How are people using them? Anytime you look up an important word in the dictionary, you'll see 3 or 4 definitions in there. And when people are talking or writing, they're picking out one of those definitions. They don't tell you. You have to figure it out from the context. The context of speech is also important. What do the things say before and after it? What does the paragraph before and after it say? So there are things that are important for us to understand how to properly interpret text, but also rules that are appropriate for us to interpret speech. So right now, you're listening to my tone of voice. You're looking at my facial expressions, and you make judgments, you make interpretations based on those facial expressions and my tone of voice. That's something that you're missing in books and letters, and it's why we can interpret these things all wrong, especially in emails. Man, this is crazy in emails, how people misinterpret emails because we don't have things like tone of voice or facial expressions. If I make a joke and I don't smile or I don't make a certain face or I don't use a tone of voice, you could take it wrong and it might be offensive. People get in these debates and discussions and arguments all the time because they're not appropriately interpreting speech. In prison, you're constantly interpreting people's facial expressions and their body language. You're trying to make a judgment, or you're trying to interpret whether somebody that you're speaking with is threatening or relaxed. You do this all the time. And there are good ways and bad ways to interpret body language. Sometimes you'll often hear in books that if somebody sits like this, it means that they're standoffish, right? But if they sit like this, then maybe they're relaxed. Well, this is not the discussion to talk about whether or not that's true, but you get my point. There are appropriate ways that you interpret a text, like the Bible or the newspaper or your textbook, appropriate ways to interpret speech by tone of voice, and nonverbals like facial expression and body language. And what does this have to do with critical thinking? Because just like judgments, when you're interpreting something, what are you doing? You're thinking. There's a thought process in the interpretation or hermeneutic process. You're adding up all these variables. When you're looking at someone's face, you're trying to figure out if that's a happy face, a sad face, a mean face. When you're reading a text, you're trying to figure out the definition of words, the meanings, the language, the context. All of this involves a thought process. And critical thinking will help you do all of that better. And that's why when we think about critical thinking, it's not just something people do in college or in school. It's something we should all do every day. It's a fundamental component of human relationships and human life. So critical thinking will help you make better judgments, and it'll help you make better interpretations of texts and books and speech. It will make you a better communicator. And one thing about communication, you may have heard somewhere else that communication is probably the number one soft skill that employers and other people make judgments about you according to. They're judging you according to things like soft skills, and your ability to communicate is probably the number one soft skill that people are looking for.